Hello, my name is Jennifer Reese, and I thought I would do a video on some of the places that I've lived and kind of give a timeline. Um, as I said, I was born in New Mexico. I assumed that I lived in Laramie before my parents went to Cheyenne, and I don't know how old I was when I lived in Cheyenne. I lived there until I was um, 18 after I graduated. And then I lived in Laramie during the school year. I lived in Cheyenne, of course, during the summers. Um, I went to school in Laramie for at UW for 3 years, and then moved back to Cheyenne for about a year. Eventually, my family's controlling um, issues were getting to be just too much, and finally got fed up, and I ended up moving to Denver. I lived at what was called the YMCA. This is when it had kind of um, it had kind of a residence program in some ways. It um, let people live there. They would pay by the month, and I lived there for a little bit. Unfortunately, I ended up getting evicted when I decided to be a little too friendly with a homeless woman who um, she was there for a few days, and then she came back, and then she wouldn't leave. And so, unfortunately, I wasn't supposed to have visitors, so I eventually got evicted. And then I lived in a place called um, the New House Motel over in Denver. It was right across from the um, uh, the Capitol building. And then I moved into a place for about a year, which was over at 12th and by 12th in Washington, and had a few problems. And I lived at the New House Motel for about three separate times. Another time I lived um, over at a place during the summer, um, and that didn't go as well. I was kind of hoping to live there a little bit longer, but it was just not a good situation. Um, eventually ended up living in another place over by 12th and Washington. I actually lived in the place next to it, and I lived there for about a year, and that's when I became pregnant with my son. And excuse me, I lived at a place over in Aurora for about a year, for a little while, and then I eventually moved to a place in Denver um, it's over by near Colfax and Federal. It was on Federal, but it was like only uh, about a actually about a block away from Colfax, and I lived there for a little bit. And unfortunately, the job that I had, I got laid off, and I wasn't able to get another job. And unfortunately, then that's the third time I ended up living back in um, at the new house, and I lived there again for about a year, and then I was going to school, and I eventually uh, befriended a woman who um, went to school with me, and she convinced me to move in with her over at a place in um, Thornton, and I lived there for a couple of years. It was um, not a good situation. I've had a bad habit of going from one bad situation to another. I seem to be getting better in that regard, but I'm kind of still working on it. But I lived there for 2 years, and it was a massive mess. And then I eventually moved back in with my mother in Cheyenne. And about 6 months after I moved in there, that's when she had her accident again. That's when she ended up being paralyzed about from here down. And I lived there in Cheyenne for a couple of years. It should be about 3 years, essentially. And during that time, I was living with my mother and my uncle. And my uncle ended up um, he had diabetes, and he had never really taken care of it, and it had finally started getting the better of him. He he injured himself, and I kept asking if he wanted to go to the hospital, which he kept refusing. And by the time I finally was able to get him to try to get him to the hospital, um, he had gangrene in part of his leg, and ended up having part of his. I don't remember. I have to admit, I don't remember which leg was, but he got part of his leg cut off, and he had a prosthetic leg, and he ended up moving over into Fort Collins. My mother ended up moving to Fort Collins because there was a nursing home that decided to take her. She, after the accident, she was in like 3 different hospitals. She was at, for a while, over Denver, what used to be called Denver General. It's now called Denver Health. And then another place called Kindred, where they tried to do some physical rehabilitation. And then she moved over to Craig Hospital for a while. And they finally got her in a power wheelchair, and um, got her to the point where she could um, be able to function a lot better. And then she moved to Cheyenne, and she was at a place called Life Care, and was having problems with getting Medicaid and Medicare, because she was a couple years from getting um, Medicare to be able to qualify for it. Excuse me. And she then ended up at the hospital again for a while, just to basically live. And then she got accepted over to, I forget what the nursing home is called, but it's a nursing home across from the Pudarelli Hospital in Fort Collins. And then after my uncle had his problems, he ended up moving to that particular nursing home as well. And I didn't have enough money from the job I had. That's at that time I worked for Argus, and I wasn't able to continue to live there. And I voluntarily left. I wasn't evicted. I moved in with um, a family, a black family over in Denver again. They lived over in what's called Park Hill, um, not far from like 38th Street. Um, like I said, one of these times when I get a vehicle again, I might go to these various places that I used to live at. And then my I was having a lot of problems living there. They had a mother who was really in the full stages of true full blown dementia, and um, was becoming increasingly dangerous. And so I decided to try to move to Laramie for a bit, although that didn't work out very well. I was still working at Argus, and I was commuting, so that ended up being not so great a situation. Um, but I ended up trying to live with a friend of mine that I worked with over at Argus in Boulder. And again, in this case, yeah, it didn't work out. And I moved back in with um, the same people over at Park Hill for a while. And again, since I was I decided to try to live in Laramie. That didn't work. So that's when I was homeless twice. I ended up being homeless in after living with the black family, and then I tried to live in Laramie, and that's when I became homeless. And I ended up staying over at uh, the shelter over in Boulder for a while. Um, and I lived there for, I think, about 6 months, 6 to 9 months, somewhere in there. I don't totally remember some of the dates, but um, and then I was in a program that was similar to Section 8, but through what they call Mental Health Partners, which was um, a program that was in both Boulder and Longmont. And I lived in Longmont for about a year. Um, and during that time, I didn't have a vehicle. And one of my managers over at Argus had a vehicle that he sold. He had a white truck that used to be part of Argus, but he managed to get it fixed up. And I'd finally just decided I was fed up, and so I moved to a place over in Cheyenne for a little bit, where unfortunately I had problems with bed bugs, and due to some other circumstances, I couldn't get down to Denver to be able to work for Argus, and so I had no job, and I ended up being homeless again. I lived over in the homeless shelter in Cheyenne for a while, and I lived there for about 9 months. And I still didn't have a place, but I tried to move to Laramie, but I didn't have. Uh, I was supposed to try to get a loan, but somebody was actually scamming me, unfortunately. So what I did was I was homeless for about 6 months in Laramie. I was sleeping in my truck. I um, ended up staying over at the Walmart, which was kind of nice because um, they more or less don't really care or pay attention because they have whatever Laramie has, especially blizzards where some of the truckers can't get over. They usually end up parking there. Sometimes they have people in their RVs or their fifth wheels stay there overnight, and it's kind of a safe haven for people who are stranded for a while. And then I eventually moved to the place where I live now, which is where I'm surrounded in. It's over at a place called the Timbers, and it's on the west side of Laramie. I live very close to the interstate, um, and it's fairly nice. It's usually pretty quiet, and I've lived here for the last couple of years, and that's been more or less my living situation. I um, eventually seem to be able to hopefully start breaking those patterns of being kind of desperately trying to get out of bad situations when it comes to my living situations. So that is it. And I'm hoping what I'll do is be able to, like I said, some of my memories are fuzzy about the timelines. I kind of have um, a fairly decent grasp on the timelines, but I'm going to try to put it. I might try to see if I can, when I post this video, try to list those places and list the times and whatnot, and um, you know, could try to give it like a framework of um, where I've lived and somewhat. I might try to do that on some other videos where I might be trying to give like timelines of where I've worked and when, and hopefully I can remember that a little bit more clearly. But hopefully I will talk to you later. And anybody, wherever you are, you have a good day or night, wherever it is. And I will talk to you later. Thank you. Bye bye.